Hello everyone, I'm Larry, and I'd like to take a moment to explain two audit testing procedures, vouching and tracing. I found in the past that some students of auditing tend to mix these two up, or maybe they even think they're the same thing. They're analogous, but they are different, and they test for two different things. So let's talk about these two and discuss the differences between vouching versus tracing. We've set up a small model here that we've drawn on this page where at the bottom, at the base, I've shown source documentation, or we can call this supporting documentation. This can be comprised of sales invoices, vendor invoices, receiving reports. These are the raw documents, the documentation that contain data that ultimately we want to bubble up, work its way up through our accounting system. And that information should ultimately be reflected in what's shown at the top here, the financial statements. Now, in reality, we understand that there is no top versus bottom here, that financial statements are not on the top of something, and that source documents are not at the bottom. But for the purpose of this discussion, we want to set up this model in our mind to help us understand what is happening here in the flow of information. So again, at the base, at the foundation, down here at the bottom, we have our source or supporting documentation that we as auditors can look at as evidence to test and see what our client has in sales invoices, vendor invoices, receiving reports, and similar things. This information should ultimately work its way up through our accounting system and find its way into the financial statements, where it will be reflected in the balances shown on the balance sheet, the income statement, the cash flow statement. So let's talk about two things that auditors are worried about. In this process, one of the first things that is a concern of the auditors is that the client has overstated the assets or the revenues that are in the financials. That is, it's possible our client has material overstatements of assets in the balances shown on the balance sheet, and possibly has material overstatements of revenues in the balance shown on the income statement. Now, how do we test for this? The technique to test for this is known as vouching. And one way we can represent this is to say we will vouch down from the financial statements down to the source or supporting documents. What we are doing when we vouch down is we are testing for what is called existence. We're testing for existence because we're concerned that maybe some of the balances in the financials have overstated the numbers in the assets and the revenues, and we want to make sure that those values can be supported down here in the supporting documentation. So we will vouch down and check for the existence of those values in the source or supporting documentation. Now, another thing that auditors are concerned about is the possibility that the client has understated liabilities or expenses in the financials. That is it possible that the client has material understatements of liabilities that are shown too low, the balances are too low, lower than they should be on the balance sheet, and that certain expenses have not been reflected on the income statement? To test for this, the process that we use can be called tracing up. We'll say trace up. And what we're testing for here is completeness. We're testing for completeness to make sure that all of those bills, all of the expenses and the liabilities that are down here shown in the supporting documentation have made it up here into the financial statements and are showing up in the liabilities and the expenses. And the reason we're using this model saying vouch down versus trace up is if you look at the arrow for vouching down, can everyone see the V? You can see the V here. that we're vouching down. And when we trace up, on this arrow, we can draw the T in. Does everyone see the T? So when we vouch down, we are testing for existence. The auditor is concerned that the client has overstated assets or revenues in the financials. So if we're worried that certain things are overstated, we will vouch down for existence to see that there is support in the supporting documentation. And here's the V on the arrow where we're vouching down. The other key auditor concern is that the client, in the financial statements, the client may have understated their liabilities or their expenses. Since we're concerned about that, the auditor will take a sample of the supporting documentation and trace those samples up to make sure that they are reflected in the financial statements to test for completeness. Did all of the liabilities and the expenses, as reflected in the supporting documentation, did all those liabilities and expenses make it up completely into the financial statements there? And that's tracing up, and we can see the T there. So again, two different things. We vouch down to test for existence because we are worried that the client may have overstated assets or revenues in the financials, and we want to check against that. We trace up to test for completeness because our concern as auditors is maybe the client has understated liabilities or expenses, and we want to check and see that supporting documentation has made it up into the financial statement so that the expenses and liabilities are appropriately recorded. I hope that helps explain the difference between vouching and tracing. Again, there really is no up or down, but this model maybe will help you understand and better remember the difference between the two.